My name is Connie Rudnick-Grayson. I'm the class of 73. And in 3 weeks, I, along with whatever number of the 55 women we were told were in our class, will be returning for our 50th reunion. So we're all very excited about that. So welcome to the first, the few female Pathbreakers at Williams panel. I have the honor of introducing this panel not only as one of the older alums, but also as a member of the We Lead Advisory Board. We Lead is our women's philanthropy initiative working to close an important gender gap in giving at Williams the number of alumni fund gifts at the leadership level of $2,500 per year or more. At some point this weekend, I would encourage you to chat with me or one of the other advisory board members, and there are several in the audience here, or scan the QR code on this bookmark. To learn more about it, we've made a lot of progress in the 5 years that we've been in existence, but we have a ways to go. So we could use some help getting to the finish line. Together, women can lead Williams into its next chapter of possibilities and impact. Who better to talk about possibilities today than our speakers? Nancy McIntyre, Associate Dean of the college during this trailblazing period. And she denies she was responsible for letting me come back, but I think she was, and I'm incredibly grateful. Ellen Vargas, class of 71, Ellen Joseph Vargas, class of 71, Wendy Wilkins Hopkins, class of 72, Suji Sutler, class of 74, and Martha Coakley, class of 75. So I'm going to turn this... I'm going to turn this over to our moderators, Wendy and Nancy.
Thank you, Connie, and welcome everyone to Ancient History class. We're actually very interested to learn who our audience is this morning. So, by a show of hands, women in the class of the decade of the 70s, could you raise your hands? Wow, thank you. How about the 80s? Do we have some? Wow, great. Any 90s? Awesome. And then the 2000s, got a few. Wow. Do we have any faculty in the room? Any staff? Great, thank you. And do we have any undergraduates? They're all busy. Or they've left campus at this point, right? Let me put on my glasses. Thanks for doing this, for joining us this morning. As I looked back over a span of more than 50 years, I've been struck by the dramatic changes and the rapidity and the relative smoothness of Williams' transition to coeducation. In the spring of 1969, 30 Vassar women were invited to spend the spring semester on campus. That fall, 60 women came on the 11 college exchange program. I know a couple of them are right here in the room. The following fall brought the first 45 transfer students to Williams in 1970 and 46 more exchange students. And then the fall of 71 brought the first 4-year co-ed class, class of 75, yeah. 137 women out of 300 plus men. And that changed the campus dramatically in the best possible way. Our panelists span these years. We're so grateful to them for being here. Thank you, ladies. Ellen was one of the first 7 women graduates from Williams, 1971. Suji transferred in the fall of 1971 and was the only African-American woman in the class of 74. And Martha was a member, of course, of that first co-ed class of 1975. So my own experience, very briefly, I was one of those 46 that came in the fall of 1970 originally as an exchange, and I wanted to take a course from Professor Whitney Stoddard. That was my reason for coming. But I was very fortunate to transfer, and one of many unique experiences was serving as a junior advisor my senior year. There were 15 of us that served as, and some of my freshmen are here actually too today, so thank you. I knew immediately upon stepping foot on this campus that I wanted to stay, and so one of the very first people that I met on campus was Dean Nancy McIntyre. So Nancy?
Am I on? Yes? Hello? You can hear me? Okay, good. Little brief history. There were 2 major decisions that Williams made. One was a fiscal decision to expand the college from 1,200 to 1,800. And then a joint, a complementary decision was, who should those extra 600, next 600 students be? More men or women? And at the time, there was a very influential report from one of the deans at Princeton called the Patterson Report, which surveyed boys, high school boys, who it turns out were less and less interested in single-sex institutions. That rippled through all of the many institutions that were still single-sex for men, and Williams then made the decision also not to do a coordinate college, which very briefly was on the radar, either at Mount Hope or down at Denison Park. Very briefly. They got a lot of advice from other presidents, among them Mrs. Bunting at Radcliffe College, to not go the coordinate education route, go fully co-ed. And that's what Williams decided to do. I didn't come to Williams thinking very much about co-education. I mean, I knew I had been hired as one of the first women senior administrators and to help the transition. But for me, co-education was the norm. I had gone to co-educational institutions all my educational career. So coming here was a job opportunity for me, frankly. And did we think of ourselves as pioneers? Well, we may have, but we chose to come to Williams for a whole variety of reasons. And I'm going to turn now over to our panelists to say in a few words, what brought you to Williams and why Williams? Ellen, want to start?
Sure, happy to do that. Is this? Yes. Yes. Okay. I came to Williams originally as an exchange student. I spent my first 2 years at Mount Holyoke College, and if those of you know who have ever been to South Hadley, it makes Williamstown look like a major metropolitan area. And in those days, there wasn't a lot of international kind of travel for students. So I came just for a semester as an exchange student, and then got here and realized, I mean, I liked Mount Holyoke. It wasn't that I was desperate to get out of there, but this seemed to just make a lot more sense. And then, of course, Williams was not planning to accept women in my class. And there was a whole kind of a hoop-de-doo about whether we could apply or what would happen. And I honestly, and Nancy, there's some urban legend about what happened. And I'm not exactly sure what happened. But it did teach me the value of looking after your own interests and advocating for yourself. In any event, Williams finally said that those of us who were transfer students present, because you had to have 2 years in residence to get a degree, could apply, and they eventually accepted 7 of us to be in the class of 71. So that is my story, how I got to Williams. It was just really a lot of the right time at the right place. I think my colleagues here, it was more intentional. It was a different kind of story. So you can hear about that.
Susie, you're on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is this good? I'm glad to be here. Hi, everybody. I think I have to start off by, I usually start off honoring ancestors, which I think is the appropriate thing to do. So I want to first honor the Stockbridge Munsee Nation, who shepherd this land that allows Williams to even be here. And I also, if I had a plant, I have water, but I would be pouring water now. I also want to call my and our ancestors into the room, paying homage to those whose shoulders we stand on, certainly our personal families, my mom and my daddy, Martin and Ellie. So many who came to Williams before me, and those who made a way for us to allow us to choose to decide to come to Williams. So please as well call your ancestors into the room, which has everything to do with the how. The how I got to Williams, when I was thinking about this, I mean, my why is a little different by the time I get there. But the how I got here, you know, as a black woman, I don't think of this as an individual. I always have to think of it as a community, and you know, and those who paved the way. So my how starts back in, it starts much further back. But I'm going to start this story with 1865 with the with the Freedmen's Bureau, and then people who were involved in the Freedmen's Bureau had everything to do with the founding of Howard University in 1867, and the law school started in 1869. And that is so important for many reasons. I mean, other than, you know, I am as well an HU alum. But in the year I was born, you know, in listening to the keynote speaker, the year I was born in 1951 was the year that Brown versus Board of Education was filed in Topeka, Kansas, which has a lot to do with me being in a lot of places, including Williams. So in 1951, that case was filed. I mean, the decision wasn't until 1954. The other date I want to highlight, 20 years later, in 1971, I mean, certainly plenty happened in between. Well, in 1965, the women's voting for black women. In 1920, it was white women. But to think that in 1965, and only 6 years later, you know, women who looked like me had just had the right to vote for the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which is important, helped get me here, or to have the decision or the choice to be here. And then in 1971, the year I actually came to Williams was the year that the Reed versus Reed case was argued, and it was argued by the ACLU lawyer, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And that was the first time that the Supreme Court relied on relied on equal protection to rule that there should be no discrimination based on race, based on sex, after the Brown versus Board of Education. So the synchronicity, I mean, you just can't even write a script like that. You know, the synchronicity just seems to be. And in what year was it? 1869, not 1869, 1885, Gaius Boland came here, who was the first black man to come, on whose shoulders I also stand. So those dates kind of popped out at me. I am, the 8 years before I came to Williams, I was educated in same-sex private schools. One outside of Cleveland, Laurel School for girls, and Emma Willard. My last 2 years. I understand there are a lot of Emma Willard people in here. And my last 2 years of high school, I was at the bottom of this mountain. And and those were years that were critical in the civil rights movement, and certainly on campuses, because students were making the way. And what was going on here at Williams was also going on at Emma Willard, particularly with the black women, the few black women that were at Emma Willard. And we used to come to conferences and road trip, I guess like the Vassar and the Wellesley. We thought we were all that, but we were high school students. We would road trip to Williams, and a number of us fell in love or in like or something like that with men here. So I had known something about Williams, and fortunately I was here during those times when Preston Washington and the brothers took over Hopkins, and nationwide students were saying we need to have African American studies, there need to be more black students, there needs to be faculty. All of that was taking place. So my thinking about Williams wasn't simply that, you know, I had attached myself to someone, but that it was about the movement for me. It was about identity. It was about black identity. That was also the time, if you recall, James Brown, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, and Marvin Gaye was going on. I mean, the music resonates so much with me. Free to Pain, Bring the Boys Home, you know, the Vietnam War, all of that was going on. So that was a big piece of also the why, because my freshman year I went to Albion, Michigan, because they didn't take women at Williams in the 70s, at least not in the freshman class. So I transferred here. Well, I got in, that helped. I did have to apply. And I think reading the reports that were written by Preston Washington about the demands that had been made, one of the demands was also that the admissions should bring in black students, not just on financial aid, but who could also pay the tuition. So I think that my family, my mom and dad could pay the tuition, also had something to do with me being attractive to Williams. And my friend, Jackie Strawn Laughlin, who's in the class of 75, also reminds me, who went to same-sex high school, that Williams probably thought that women who went to same-sex high schools also had like ovaries of steel. And that may or may not be true, but so that's part of my story on how I got to Williams.
Yeah, mine's a little bit less dramatic than that, Susan. And thank you all for being here. And thanks, we have a lot of people from class of 75, right? Yay! Our guinea pigs in a large group for coeducation. For me, it was pretty simple. I grew up in North Adams, and so Williamstown looked like an upscale, wonderful place to be compared to North Adams. I was in the middle of 5 children, grew up in a Catholic family. My 2 older sisters had gone to Catholic all-girls school, and I wanted nothing to do with it. And I had left Catholic school to go to the Drury High School, the public school, my senior year, and I said, oh, Williams is going co-ed. Now I can go. And it wasn't really much more than that. I got accepted. I started and found a lot of it was fun, a lot of it wasn't. We all went through some of the integration that was great. And I'm going to echo some of the themes you heard from Yvonne Howe earlier this morning. about how lucky we were in some ways to be here, even though there was some pushback. Not at the time so much from our classmates, but there were some faculty. A quick example of this, Gwen Rankin, who was in our class, and I, neither of whom, by the way, were either revolutionary or ardent feminists, said, we don't have any gynecological services here. And we started, with Nancy's help, the Williams Women. We got a closet somewhere in the career counseling office. And we did some stuff at Winter Study that wasn't just about building snowmen and dates. But we also did the Williams Guide to Health and Sex. And it was really about trying to make Williams accommodating to the women who were here. We weren't trying to blow it up. And there was one professor who said, well, if you don't like it here, why did you come? And I didn't get angry at it. I just took a deep breath, and I'll talk about that later. But it was an interesting time because most of us came because we thought it was a good school, and we didn't think that much about what we were doing or not. As you know the least about the times you grow up in sometimes, despite the culture around us. But that's how I ended here, and I'm glad I did.
I think most people think that Williams did the transition very well in contrast to a lot of other places. And some of those reasons will resonate with you. No fraternities. I think that that decision by the college, that the implementation of that decision by the college had been made before women entered, and that affected the residential life of this campus dramatically, I think, and was positive for women, despite the fact that there were a few signs, thanks to Carter Green. These signs were this was up at the Fort, which is no longer called Fort Huzak, but it's the graduate art. Excuse me? Yeah. But actually, I think that the small size and the commitment to the undergraduate education, housing was in place. It was a lovely setting. There was an openness about the senior administration. And I think that many of us felt that although there were some problems that we dealt with, that the college on the whole was committed to the transition to coeducation. But let's talk about some of these positive or less positive experiences that those of you who are here experienced during your 4 years. Sure, where you go?
So, I mean, by and large, just it's hard to compare because you didn't go to college anyplace else, right? So there were women who didn't like it here, but there are plenty of men. If you do fundraising in your classes, you know some people like to give and some people don't. And so I try and separate that out. I think I was as happy at Williams as I would have been any place, but college is a time of growth and testing, and some semesters were better than others, as we found out. I think doing the freshman women's housing exactly the way the men's housing was done made a lot of sense. I see people from my entry. In Sage A, we still, thanks to Clive Hewlett, do phone calls, to keep up with each other. So that bonding of women early on, because we did get scattered out all over the campus, even with our class, we got separated by houses, so a lot of us say we didn't really know that many women in our class, unless you were in sports or in the major, or lived in a house with someone, you may not have met other women. But we have since, and I agree. Nancy and I had a chance senior year to go down to Amherst because they were going co-ed. We told them how to do it, right, Nancy? They didn't follow all of our advice.
It's on. Can you hear me? Because I came in as a transfer student, I hear so many people talk about, well, it's a mix, particularly with the black women that I've talked to and read about their experience in the quad. I didn't have that experience. So I didn't have the camaraderie that people talk about who came into the freshman class and had the quad and JAs. I didn't have any of that. I was at Gladden House for 2 years, for sophomore and junior year. Then I lived off campus. So I didn't have that experience. So there was certainly some isolation. I felt kind of, I knew a number of the men who were here. I got to know. I'm closer probably to many of the, and I was closest to the black community while I was here. I will say I've been on a Zoom with classmates women from the class of 1974, and I didn't know anybody. I didn't know any of the women, really. Probably if I did it again, I might do that a little differently, but I did not have a close relationship with the women in my class. I had very close relationships with a few women in the class of 73 and lots of women in the class of 75, and then other classes that came in before I graduated. I mean, the irony of it, to come to what is called now a PWI, primarily white institute, at the time that I did, I mean, and identity and black identity and civil rights, I mean, there was so much going on here, so much richness. I mean, listening to Yvonne, I mean, I learned a lot about, well, I certainly became a woman while I was here, being a black woman while I was here. And so most of my community were the African American students that were here. And I came in as a philosophy major. And oh my God, the experience I had in the classes, I was first the only woman, the only black, and it was like, 8 people. I mean, who wants to be a philosopher? I mean, I hear people now, parents who say, how are you going to get a job if you're going to be a philosophy major? But I came in as a philosophy major that only lasted a year. And my experience in the classroom, because I was just so, I wasn't scared, I wasn't intimidated. I shared this, someone told me I should share this, but it is a funny story. We would talk about Kant and, all this stuff and God, and I would say things like, they would talk about God and he, and I was like, first of all, God's a woman, and she's black. And they would look at me like, oh God, we got this crazy in the class. And I can remember one of the classes where I said this, the man who was teaching was on like an adjunct from Yale. And he pulled me aside after class one day and said, you need some psychological counseling. And, I told him, you need to go back to Yale. And so, I had those kind of experiences in the classroom, but then I was able to switch with American civilization. I was able, and Joe Harris was now here, Dr. Harris, teaching African American studies, and Bobby Steptoe and Professor Exum came in, and Reggie Gilliam. It allowed me, here at Williams, and it wasn't happening in a lot of places, to really do a deep dive into African American studies, literature, history, political science. I mean, it allowed me to do that, and I'm grateful for that.
Well, when I got here, Williams wasn't really ready for women. Nancy wasn't here, so that just speaks volumes. It was just kind of figuring it out as we went, and there were, even being able to apply to come, the living accommodations. I was in Lambert House my first year, and I remember when it had just been converted, and it wasn't completely converted when we got there. I remember I was in a first floor room which sort of went into a common room in the middle, if any of you have ever been in there, and there were no doors, and it didn't occur. I mean, we had to have a conversation about how we needed to sort of have a wall between our room. It was done, but it was a conversation. Most of the people, I don't remember those signs. I mean, I remember grumbling. I remember a general sense that Williams was such a better school than Mount Holyoke, so who wouldn't have wanted to make it? Not true. Mount Holyoke was academically every bit as good and in some ways more demanding. So I thought, sort of the boys had it easy and expected to have it easy. But generally, Williams, as a small institution, was welcoming, if a little confused and a little confusing. I do remember in those years there was no physical education for the women. It never occurred to anybody that there should be. I remember that they were still was it the professors? They had a nude swim in the gym, and women were not invited, thank God. And so it was just really trying to feel its way. And as to repeat again, fits and starts. Most people were welcoming. Most people were happy to have us here, as I recall, although that didn't stop us from fighting about one thing or another. And I do think that in some ways my experience here made it easier as I went on in life to become a lawyer and fight with the NCAA over Title IX issues and ultimately get in litigation with one of the big tobacco companies. I felt prepared.
So before we turn it into Q&A, I want to just put another historical context. Williams was making so many changes in the mid to late 60s. The introduction of the 414 curriculum, the introduction of environmental studies, the introduction of African American studies, and the hiring of Joe Harris and other black faculty. It was quite an extraordinary period of time for a small institution that heretofore had been considered a rather sleepy and maybe conservative place in western Massachusetts. So I think there are lots of things to be proud of about this institution in that period of time. And I want to just, before we turn to Q&A, I want to ask the three of you to say, what did you come away with and why does it matter? Why does all of this matter?
I'll be quick. We want to have a discussion with you because a friend of mine from Williams says a lecture is a long answer to a question nobody asked. So I used that a lot, by the way, when I was running for office. So real quickly, two things that I learned that were really important that echo what Yvonne said this morning. I got a great education. I was in the History of Ideas program. It taught me a lot about how to pick the best professors rather than just the courses. And it stayed with me through my career in law and in government that multidisciplinary and problem solving requires that liberal arts approach. And that was true when looking at child abuse and looking at human trafficking, changing the lens from thinking about women as women of the street to victims of men by and large. And that was really important. And the other thing I think I learned that you can work from inside and be a revolutionary and change things. There are different models for how you change the world, right? I chose, standing up, taking risk, losing. I mean, I lost to Scott Brown, for heaven's sake, the worst person in the world on Saturday Night Live. How else could you get there? But I always said, what's the worst thing that can happen? You can lose a race. If you don't take those risks, you won't make any progress. And I learned that at Williams. You take risks and you win and lose. And you get back up and do it again. So it did matter. And let me just end with this. A couple of months ago, there was a senior at Williams named Grace Kim who was doing a paper for her senior thesis on why women don't run for office. So she interviewed me, Jane Swift, who was the acting governor of Massachusetts, and Tricia Bouvier, who's a state rep out in Pittsfield. She just sent me her paper this week, and it's a terrific paper. And I thought, here's 50 years later, this is why it matters. We have women at Williams who are looking at all of these issues from a very well-grounded liberal arts point of view, and they, like all of you and Yvonne, are going to go off and change the world. So it does matter.
Okay, thank you. We'll go out of order. I'll take a slightly different tack on this, which is why does our experience, which now seems like dusty history, matter today? I mean, clearly one of the reasons it matters is because of all of the amazing individual opportunities that people have. But I think one of the important reasons to think about this today is to put it at a moment in time where so many of the changes of which Williams was certainly part of that vanguard of whatever modern second wave kind of changes, and part of it. But we look all around us and we see so much of this progress threatened. And while I don't expect that Williams is about to go back to being a single-sex men's school at this point, I think, you never know, given, good thing we're not in Florida, I think. But I think it is something, as part of the reflection that we all need to do today about where we are at this moment in history and where so many advances, women's rights, civil rights, you can go down a long list, are under real threat. And so I think it's important to reflect on that dusty history and remember how we got where we are today. So I think that's worthwhile.
I put this initially as the so what question. You know, when I was asked to be on the panel about being the first woman, sometimes being the first isn't a compliment to an institution, but depending on the times and the place. But so what? One of the things I've noticed, I have come back to Williams many times since 1974, and I'm usually invited back by black students. When Paula Tabor was here, she was the person who first got me back, and you know, Mike Reed, and to participate in employment, the bowling weekends and things like that. I was here a couple of weeks ago. I just had the pleasure of serving on your EC board that I just came off of a couple of weeks ago. And I come back, and oftentimes black students, and in particular black women, run up to me and they find out my name, and it's like, oh, you're Suji Sutler. I'm so glad. And I'm looking at them like, I mean, so what? It's like, when we're in it, my 18 self, I mean, I'm 71 now. My 18 and 19 self would be, of course, looking at this differently than my 71. I mean, I'm glad to be able to be alive at 71 to look back, because I'm kind of I'm ending where I started. The people who come before us, I mean, even in preparing for this, I'm always reading the history of who came through Williams and where they went and what they're doing. And I started the story with, Howard. I mean, Williams has an incredible history, many of you may not know, in connection to Howard University, and has had long before Sterling Brown graduated in 1922 and then went to Howard, Rayford Logan, these incredible folks who went to Howard. I mean, the legal team, that's why I start off with Brown versus Board, the legal team that made Brown versus Board of Ed. I mean, I have my own feelings about that, the good and the bad, and how I think in many ways it has negatively impacted black communities over the years. But in terms of education, how, it was folks who went to Howard, some of whom went to Williams, who made all that happen. Pauli Murray, a woman who really wrote the blueprint for Brown versus Board, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg on her brief put Pauli Murray at the bottom of the brief because it was her research that she relied on in order to make that Reed versus Reed. I mean, we don't know. So as I'm doing this and hearing these names, then I'm thinking about women and folks who come up to me now and say like, oh, you were there back then and you did X, Y, and Z. it begins to put even this in context for me personally, because it's so important, the things that we did, because when we're in and of it, we don't really know until if we live long enough to look back and see how it has made a difference. So.
So I hope this has prompted some Q&A from our audience here. Are there some questions?
This is like a factual question, and if you don't have the answer, it's okay. Suji mentioned the hiring of some of the first black faculty at the college, and I was wondering when the first female professors were hired, and also what the ratio is today in terms of male and female professors, and also white professors, black professors of color, et cetera, and how those statistics have changed over the decades. Thank you.
Nancy, that's...
Well, the first woman to receive tenure was someone named Doris de Keyserlingk, who was in the Russian department, though ironically, she was never made a full professor. She was with tenure as an associate professor. The year that I came in 71, there were 7 tenure track women on the faculty of, 100, almost 200, I suppose. And then some of the other women who had part-time faculty appointments were spouses. That was a pattern at institutions like Williams. Then I think that Williams was slower to recognize that if you're going to value the undergraduate education of your women, and I think Williams really did do that, then you've got to promote their persistence in academia and graduate opportunities and sending them to graduate school and then hiring them. And I think it took a while for Williams to understand that. And in fact, there's nothing in the report on the Committee on Coordinate Education and Related Matters, which was the official title of that faculty trustee committee, that really gets at that question. It's a lot about what Williams will bring to Williams, what women will bring to Williams, rather than an overt statement about what Williams can offer women. Did I say that right? Did I get it in the right order? Anyway, so that's I think that was a deficiency that I wrote about a little bit in an article in the Alumni Review when I came. But the college has now, and did have even then, an affirmative action plan and program for hiring women and faculty of color. It took longer, I think, some of us think, to do that. And this was not always the most agreeable place for young single women faculty or young single men, African-American men and women to come and stay. So those early years of coeducation, women on the faculty that I remember left. And it took maybe another 10 years or so to really start getting a cadre of women faculty and of color who would stay. And so the statistics now, I'm not sure, because I've been out of the scene for a while. So, but I think that in all of the departments, interestingly, when I was doing affirmative, after I was in the dean's office, I became the assistant to the president for affirmative action and government relations. So then I started working on faculty hiring with departments, and interestingly enough, some of the science departments were the most aggressive in seeking out women faculty. Thanks to the young men in those departments who thought it was important for their students to have a diverse teaching group. And so I really, really appreciated the initiative that a number of the science departments took to do that. And I think in the departments now, there are senior women in all of the, I think in all of the, in fact, some have retired. I can't go further than that for you.
Other questions?
I think we might already be cutting into our refreshment break. Yes.
Oh, we're at the,
So
we're
we
at the
don't want
end.
to keep you all from treats, but you please continue the conversation throughout the day. This was wonderful. Nancy had some final words to share with you all.
We're going to hang around in the lobby a little bit afterwards, but let me conclude by saying we barely scratched the surface. We'd love to see you more, talk with you more. As a last thought, some of the references to thoughts and comments from yesterday's sessions with Maud and Kristen and others have mentioned Yvonne's talk this morning. We hope that through your Williams experience you've received and will continue to receive an excellent education and the resolve to build your own narratives. Ask yourselves, what if? Get in the room and get to the table and speak up. And above all, to lead purposeful lives in whatever way that is best for you and your best pals. So thank you.